as you know, we've had layoffs now at Algoma Steel. The CEO of that company came out and said, well, it was largely due to the tariffs. But if we were close to a deal on steel and aluminum, could those layoffs have been prevented if the ads had not come out when they did? And the deal that was apparently on the table, you've spoken about this yourself, Ambassador, had come out and borne fruit, as it were.
I don't think there's any doubt that everybody believed that we were close to a deal. The Canadians believed it. The Canadian negotiating team believed it. The American negotiating team, excuse me, believed we were close to an agreement. But since the details of that agreement are not public, and since even when you get to a deal, if you only have that far to go, you don't have a deal until everything is done. So it's possible that those jobs could have been saved. Bottom line is, if we'd reached an agreement, we would have reached it on four or five critical areas. We would have been steel, aluminum. You do that, that has a big impact on autos. While automobile final production was not intended to be addressed in this agreement. If you're dealing with steel and aluminum, there's a lot of steel and aluminum in automobiles, and you would have moved forward, I think, on the auto issue as well. And then energy and uranium, it would have, as both the president and the prime minister had indicated, it would have put wins on the board. You put wins on the board, you develop a relationship that says, okay, let's go on to some of the other stuff and move on.
There you have it, guys. Today is Thursday, December 18th. My name is Miloš Krajčnik. Today I have one story I want to talk about. I mean, you guessed it, it's the CUSMA story. And the reason why I really want to dig into this a bit is because obviously it's really impacting all of the trade negotiations. It's really the crux of the trade negotiations, if you will, right? It's the revamped North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, right? It's something that honestly I really believe should exist in general, just because we're on a continent more or less on our own. What they're really trying to target right now is the Trump administration's publicly laying out conditions that Canada must meet if it wants to continue CUSMA and have it extended beyond the upcoming review, right? So right now it's being reviewed on a yearly basis. And the Trump administration essentially wants to have all of this ironed out before they sign on to a 16-year agreement. This includes Mexico as well. Mexico has its own set of policies it has to regulate, essentially. But the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, which we'll get into in a second, is targeting specific Canadian policies, including dairy supply management, provincial alcohol bans. We saw that Ontario put bans on U.S. alcohol. Jameson, for instance, hasn't been sold. Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels took a massive hit in its Ontario sales. It's like down 60%. We have procurement rules that they want us to adhere to, and digital regulation. So this is really a renewal. The renewal is really conditional rather than automatic, right? And they get into it. Ottawa's already kind of made some concessions. We've scrapped this digital services tax that Blackface Justin put on a while back. We've also rolled back any retaliatory tariffs, or some of them at least. The U.S. hasn't really committed to lifting any of its own sector-specific tariffs, like on steel and aluminum and lumber. But I mean, obviously, it's because they're the U.S. and they won't do it until they're sure that what they have on the table is good for them, right? Honestly, it makes sense. If I was the U.S., I probably would act in a relatively similar way. Maybe the rhetoric would be a little different, but I mean, I fully understand what they're doing. So it says here, the Trump trade rep targets Canada's beer and dairy rules and new CUSMA review conditions, right? So this is a CBC article. It says U.S. President Donald Trump's point person on trade laid out a series of conditions Wednesday that Canada must meet in order to extend the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, CUSMA, when it comes up for review next year, revealing publicly for the first time what the administration expects Prime Minister Mark Carney to do to keep the pact for the long term, right? So it says U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer told Congress that CUSMA has been successful to a certain degree, but there need to be changes before Trump agrees to extend it for another 16 years or revert to yearly reviews, something Canada is eager to avoid given the resulting annual uncertainty, right? So the pressure is really on Canada, 100%, and Mexico. Mexico has more like labor laws that they need to adhere to, right? But so it's, it says here, they want to extend it for a 16-year term. Obviously, that kind of stability is going to, mean a ton for everybody, right? Not only for Canada and Mexico, but also for the U.S. No one needs this ambiguity, this uncertainty, right? The biggest problem is that it actually hurts the Canadian economy very seriously. It's impacting the U.S. economy as well, but the U.S. economy is obviously just so much bigger than the Canadian economy. It's a lot more self-sufficient as well. Like they have their own manufacturing jobs, they have their own innovation in various different sectors, right? Canada's more of like a specialized economy, if you will. We're high in services and big on natural resources that we don't refine, right? So this is really Canada's biggest issue, is that we're not actually refining our natural resources and creating end products, right? The best we do is usually secondary goods, right? With like steel and aluminum that'll get sold into the auto industry, which will actually make a finished product, right? Market access for dairy. So Greer said the U.S. will take aim at two major Canadian policies: the Online Streaming Act, which brought online platforms like Netflix, Spotify, and YouTube under Canadian broadcasting rules in the supply management dairy sector, among others. Greer said that the CUSMA review, to be successful, Canada must bolster market access for U.S. dairy products and address Canada's exports of certain dairy products in an apparent reference to claims that the Canadian sector allegedly dumps milk ingredients cheaply, undercutting American producers. And I mean, this makes sense to a degree, the dairy supply. Like if we're supposed to have this free trade on everything, we can subsidize our stuff. We should subsidize certain things, but if it's going to be an open border, then it has to be an open border. It says down here that the U.S. hasn't even hit its import quotas and that it's not fair that they're trying to, expand this. But if it's free trade, it's free trade, right? I mean, this should really be a two-way thing. And that, and I actually believe that. So I don't if we're gonna have that type of free trade, it should be open borders for Canada. It should be open borders for the U.S. Clean slate, right? This Online Streaming Act, I'm gonna get into this in a second. Down here it says boycott hits liquor giant. So Greer also wants Canada to address the provincial bans on the distribution of U.S. alcohol beverages, which came about as a form of protest to Trump's aggressive tariff action on key sectors like steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. So they hit us with our in the manufacturing industry, and we hit them with alcohol. What a jab! What a nice little we gave to the U.S. Apparently, we did impact the spirits giant Brown-Forman, the maker of Jack Daniels, seen a sales plunge of more than 60%. It's not really comparable though, because alcohol is alcohol. You don't really have to drink alcohol. You're just ruining recreation for a couple people, right? That's not how you really want to, handle this, right? Metal is industry. You need it for everything, right? And it's a serious employer, and it's their strategic resources. I want to play this video really quick, and then I'm going to...
Katie, what have you learned? Well, it seems those provincial bans on the sale of American booze may have hit a sore spot. Alcohol, dairy, and energy, all three made the list of demands from the U.S. if it is to remain in the three-way trade agreement with Canada and Mexico known as CUSMA. The top trade official for the Trump administration outlined the changes the president wants to see in a report submitted to Congress. For Canada, that includes an end to those provincial bans on the sale of American alcohol, making it easier for American farmers to sell dairy products into Canada, changes to the Online Streaming Act and the Online News Act, which some American tech giants don't like. Some provinces need to make it easier for American companies to bid on projects, and there are other demands as well. The U.S. also wants some changes from Mexico and for all three countries to work together. There is a long list here. It is a big deal to finally see some specifics, given how important this trade agreement is for Canadian workers and Canadian businesses.
It really is. So, Katie, what are we watching for next?
CUSMA is up for review next year. Think of it as a mandatory check-in for all three countries to ensure the deal is working how everyone intended. Canada and Mexico had been hoping this review process would be low-key and easy, but with Trump back in office, it's no surprise he's trying to squeeze his trading partners to make the terms more favorable for Americans. One thing to keep in mind, this is just the start of what is likely going to be a long and messy process. The Trump team could come up with more demands and request additional concessions. Now, we already know what Canada has been pushing for. It wants to stay in the agreement, and it wants to see an end to those separate tariffs that are pummeling Canadian industries: steel, aluminum, copper, and wood. Canada has a monumental task ahead. Keep this three-way trade deal alive in a good enough shape that it can continue to grow the Canadian economy, and find a way to get Trump to lift, or at the very least, lower some of those tariffs. It is going to be a year.
It sure is. Thanks for this, Katie. Katie Simpson in Washington tonight.
There you have it, guys. So what's this really showing us, right? The U.S. is no longer viewing CUSMA as a settled deal, right? And it's prepared to revert to annual reviews if Canada doesn't agree to reforms. This, I mean, again, also includes Mexico, right? So it's obviously a massive impact on Canadian exports. The Canadian economy is heavily reliant on exports to the U.S., right? We really need to fix this. We really need to, get this done in the best way possible for us. So that we can relieve all of this, we can have some kind of, let's say, temporary relief. We can have some stability over, like, at least the midterm, right? 16 years isn't that long of a period of time, right? But in that time, if we had a good national strategy, we need to actively invest in ourselves, raise any trade barriers interprovincially, like within the nation, internationally, so that Canadian industry can support Canadian businesses, right, directly, so that we don't have to rely on U.S. imports into Canada or U.S. exports into Canada for different provinces, right? We need to be self-sustaining, right? The immediate problem is us to get this trade deal done, because honestly, I do believe that we need to act as like a cohesive continent, because I think the power projection of North America across the world would just be insane, to be honest. And the market would be crazy. And it's just a beautiful continent overall, right? But what I do want to talk about, and I think this is very interesting, and one point I wanted to make before I move into the online streaming act, is this digital services tax that we've lifted off the U.S. So this tax, and it's funny that we're so quick to lift taxes on U.S. companies, but we're not so quick to lift taxes, all of these burdensome taxes that the federal government has put over the last 12 years on Canadians, like all of these ESG carbon taxes and all that garbage that's just been hitting the pockets of Canadians regularly. So this digital services tax is a Canadian tax that was aimed at large foreign tech companies that earn revenue on Canadian users, but pay relatively little corporate tax in Canada, right? So it's not enough that these people are employing here, that they have offices opened up here, that they're paying their taxes. They're employing people. Tech usually employs high salary wages. We're going to tax those companies additionally just for kicks, right? It was a small tax. It was 3% on certain digital revenues. So revenues, right? So revenues, not profits, generated from Canadian users. This included online advertising, digital marketplaces, and the sale and licensing of user data, right? So it just seems funny how quickly we are to roll back taxes on foreigners, but not on ourselves. Getting into the Online Streaming Act, it amends Canada's Broadcasting Act to bring digital platforms like Netflix, Spotify, and YouTube under the CRTC regulation, right? So it actually requires these platforms to financially contribute to Canadian content production similar to traditional broadcasters, right? So the CRTC is empowered to impose discoverability requirements, meaning platforms may be forced to promote Canadian content through algorithmic adjustments. So essentially, Canada wants to get into these broadcasters, these streaming platforms, algorithms, to push content on Canadian consumers, right? And so this is obviously controversial in a number of ways. These are basically control levers. These are basically control levers, if you will, on what Canadians can and cannot watch, right? Because if you have access to a private company's algorithm on what your citizenry is going to be watching, what your public is watching, the Canadian government wants to directly have a say on what Canadians can and cannot watch. And so it represents a major expansion of state regulation into online speech in digital distribution rather than traditional broadcasting, right? This discoverability mandate raises concerns about indirect government influence over algorithms and what content Canadians see and don't see, right? The government claims the user-generated content is excluded. The language leaves room for creators to be affected indirectly through platform compliance. So they can actually affect what kind of compliance the regulators are going to be pushing, right? So Canadian digital creators with global audiences fear reduced reach, lower revenue, and algorithmic suppression in favor of domestically favored content, right? So they can literally just narrow everything. They can just pull levers and narrow your profitability, your revenues, who you're going to be reaching out to. If the Canadian government doesn't want certain information to be shown in the US, for instance, what's going on in Canada, hey, we'll just play around with the algorithm. No American's going to see what kind of nonsense is going on in Canada. That's kind of what this allows you to do, right? And so this act was passed before there were any clear rules existed, creating regulatory uncertainty for platforms, creators, and advertisers. Obviously, why the U.S. cares is this platforms most affected by the act are overwhelmingly American companies because Canada doesn't really have its own tech giants in these streaming platforms outside of Rumble, which is a public company now. But Rumble's all about free speech itself, right? It's less regulated than YouTube, right? The mandatory financial contributions and content promotion requirements, they can be framed as protectionist barriers to market access into Canada, right? As well, because if you're going to be dictating to the US companies what's going to be played and not played in Canada, then you kind of have a say on Canadian markets, right? But we're trying to push this free market trade, right? And the key thing is algorithmic interference raises concerns about free expression, commercial discrimination, and precedent-setting regulations, right? If Canada does it, then other countries around the world can do the same thing, right? And this is something that the U.S. absolutely does not want to do. The U.S. protects its companies. It does not allow them to be bullied by anybody, really, to be honest. This could be a way of the U.S. actually protecting free speech in Canada. It's obviously not Washington's stated goal, but by challenging algorithmic manipulation and discriminatory regulation, the U.S. can effectively push back against government influence. But yeah, overall, this CUSMA deal situation. Canada's entering this review from a weaker position, obviously, after years of policy choices that have increased dependency rather than resilience to the US. We continually keep integrating ourselves into their system instead of building independent Canadian mechanisms that are going to help Canadian businesses grow within our own borders, right? Ottawa has aligned itself closely with US tariffs when convenient, and then we've reversed course when the costs became politically painful, right? And now we're constantly trying to reverse course. We're trying to find all of these new trade partners. But the biggest issue, it's still down south. We need to have a good deal made with the US so that we can actually start building an independent Canadian economic policy, a national strategy. Tell me what you guys think. This is all I have for us today. Please like, share, and subscribe. Stay informed, stay curious, and God bless Canada.